There is a strange irony in the way we have constructed this modern existence. With each passing day, we accumulate more tools, more conveniences, more channels through which to soothe the restless whispering of the mind. And yet, we find ourselves adrift, not for lack of distraction, but for the very abundance of it. The mind, once a fertile garden where ideas and longings could take root and grow wild, has become a field trampled by the endless passage of shallow impressions. We have come to confuse movement with progress, stimulation with nourishment. 1,000 screens flicker in our palms, promising to fulfill us, yet each glow leaves us emptier than before. It is not that the human spirit has lost its hunger for meaning. It is that it has been seduced into chasing 1,000 hollow appetites that only sharpen the ache they pretend to quiet. There is no mystery in why so many feel their willpower dissolving, like mist under the glare of a harsh sun. It is not weakness that has stolen their resolve, but the slow erosion of their inner world by the ceaseless noise of a culture unable to abide stillness. In such a landscape, it is no wonder the soul grows weary. We were not made to live perpetually outwards, forever dangling on the hook of novelty. We were shaped across eons to know the rhythms of season and silence, the fertile pause before new growth. It was this same truth that Viktor Frankl uncovered amid unspeakable suffering. In a place where every comfort had been annihilated, where each day was a confrontation with annihilation itself, he perceived a hidden reservoir of strength that defied logic. Others perished within, collapsing into the void of meaninglessness. Yet some, whose hearts had fastened themselves to a reason for enduring, no matter how small or intangible, survived with their humanity intact. In that bleakest crucible, Frankl glimpsed the essence of human vitality, the will to meaning, not the shallow impulse to amuse oneself, nor the fleeting pleasure of distraction, but the fierce insistence that life holds a significance worthy of our devotion. The tragedy of our era is that we have inherited 1,000 ways to escape ourselves, but have forgotten how to dwell within our own being. And so, we tap and scroll, compelled by the craving for novelty, certain that the next image, the next headline, will finally bring relief. But every instant we reach outward, we drift further from the quiet ground where meaning waits to be discovered. The mind, fed on this steady diet of artificial stimulation, grows numb to the subtle textures of real experience. A tender conversation feels dull. A walk in the early light feels burdensome. The soul, disoriented by this carnival of trivialities, begins to wonder if anything matters at all. There is an ache that comes when life is no longer lived from the inside out, a fatigue deeper than any bodily weariness. This is not the tiredness of exertion, but of a spirit starved of substance. And it manifests as a paralysis that feels insurmountable. You may recognize its signs: the inability to begin, the dull sense that every endeavor is futile, the suspicion that nothing will satisfy. It is tempting to scold oneself for this malaise, to label it laziness or lack of discipline. But perhaps this indictment misses the mark entirely. Perhaps what you call weakness is, in truth, the refusal of your soul to keep pretending that this life of compulsive consumption has anything to offer. The human mind was not designed to be lit by 1,000 artificial suns. It was made to dwell in cycles of brightness and shadow, activity and rest, stimulation and reflection. When these cycles are broken, when every empty moment is drowned in flickering distraction, the psyche begins to fracture. You may feel it as an inarticulate longing, an ache you cannot name. It is your deepest self calling you back to the ancient, unhurried rhythm of a life lived deliberately. And in the dissonance between this yearning and the relentless demands of the hyper-connected world, something precious is lost. It is easy to forget that boredom is not an enemy, that silence is not an absence, but a space where the soul has room to speak. When we flee these moments, when we stuff every pause with more content, more stimulation, we sever ourselves from the very ground of purpose, because it is in that unadorned silence that the questions that define us emerge. Who am I when nothing distracts me? What do I love beyond all reward? What, if anything, would I suffer to preserve? These are questions that no algorithm will answer, no notification will illuminate. They are questions whose replies unfold slowly in the dark soil of solitude. Frankl knew this truth so intimately that he risked his life to preserve it. While the world around him was consumed by brutality, he discovered that there is a freedom no captor can extinguish, the freedom to choose one's own response to existence. This liberty does not rest upon circumstance. It does not require safety or success. It asks only that we attend to that still space between impulse and action. In that space, we reclaim the authorship of our lives. But what happens when we abandon that interval? When we allow ourselves to be swept away by each passing stimulus? The answer is plain. We become not the authors of our destiny, but its passive witnesses. We trade sovereignty for sedation. The most insidious effect of this trade is the dulling of desire itself. The constant small jolts of digital pleasure flatten the appetite for anything richer or more enduring. 1,000 trivial gratifications do not add up to a single moment of genuine fulfillment. And so the spirit becomes restless, addicted to novelty, yet incapable of real satisfaction. It is as if we have been trained to crave only what leaves us emptier than before. This is the invisible crisis of our age, a hunger that can never be sated because it is not aimed at anything real. One could spend a lifetime in this state, always consuming, never nourishing. But even in the depths of this psychic exhaustion, a faint glimmer of possibility remains. It is the memory, half forgotten, that something more is possible. That life, stripped of its glittering distractions, can still offer an authentic encounter with meaning. This possibility does not announce itself with fanfare. It whispers, it waits, and it demands that we first relinquish the compulsive need to be endlessly stimulated. If you have ever found yourself lying awake, unable to name the emptiness pressing against your ribs, you have already brushed against this deeper hunger. If you have felt the peculiar grief that follows an evening of passive consumption, if you have noticed how each indulgence leaves you less alive than before, you have glimpsed the contours of this invisible malady. And if you can recognize it, you are already closer to something precious. Because it is only in acknowledging our disconnection that we begin to imagine another way of being. It is a rare courage to turn away from the clamor of the world and face the quiet that remains. For in that quiet, all the neglected truths come flooding back. The knowledge of your own longing, the awareness of your mortality, the fierce clarity of your desires. These are not always comfortable revelations, but they are the raw material of a life that belongs to you, and in a culture that profits from your perpetual distraction. Reclaiming that life is the most subversive act you can undertake. When we speak of demotivation, we must be honest about its origin. It does not arise because you are defective. It arises because you have been convinced that what matters most can be found in the glow of a screen or the metrics of performance. It is the silent protest of a spirit that refuses to live on the surface any longer. The psyche knows when it is being starved. It knows when every act is a hollow performance, and eventually, it refuses to keep participating in the farce. This refusal is not the end of your vitality. It is its first stirring. The first sign that something within you remembers the possibility of a different existence, one that does not depend on applause or distraction, one that does not require you to outrun your own discontent. It is the beginning of the slow return to yourself. And though that return will not happen all at once, each moment you choose presence over sedation, meaning over impulse, you take another step toward home. There is a peculiar sadness in watching a mind that once burned with curiosity become a vessel for other people's desires. It does not happen all at once. It is an erosion so gradual that you hardly notice the pieces being carried away. At first, it feels harmless to fill the empty minutes with the glow of endless content. It feels like connection, like engagement, like life itself. But little by little, something essential recedes. The capacity to be still, the capacity to feel, the capacity to know oneself without the scaffolding of external validation. A mind deprived of silence begins to fray in ways that are difficult to articulate. It becomes a mind that no longer ponders, but merely reacts, chasing one stimulus after another in the hope that the next surge of novelty will dispel the growing sense of vacancy. This is the hidden cost of hyperstimulation, the loss of the inner sanctuary where reflection can occur. Reflection is not merely thinking. It is the profound act of stepping back, of observing your impulses without surrendering to them, of letting your experience ripen into wisdom. When that sanctuary is overrun by noise, all that remains is a restless hunger that no amount of consumption can appease. The most disquieting truth is that this restlessness is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of a culture engineered to monetize your attention. The more fractured your focus, the easier it is to entice you with illusions of fulfillment. A mind unable to linger in its own company will always search for relief in the nearest distraction. And so, we are conditioned to flee the very emptiness that could restore us. We are taught to be suspicious of stillness, to dread the quiet in which we might finally hear ourselves. But if you sit long enough in the hollow ache of silence, you may discover that what you have called emptiness is in fact unspent potential. Underneath the discomfort lies the clarity you have been chasing. The reason you feel so tired is not because you have no energy, but because you have spent it running from your own depths. There is no energy more depleting than the constant vigilance required to avoid your truth. And yet, every escape leaves the same residue of disappointment, the same faint nausea of having betrayed yourself again. The Danish philosopher who warned that the greatest despair is to become someone other than yourself was not speaking in abstraction. He was naming a universal wound. When you are cut off from your most authentic desires and convictions, when you live by scripts handed to you by strangers, the soul withdraws its vitality in protest. You may still go through the motions. You may still meet deadlines, perform duties, even achieve success by the world's standards. But in the secret chambers of your being, you will feel the slow withering of what makes life luminous. And in that withering, motivation dies. We have been trained to interpret this death as failure, as though a deficit of willpower were to blame, as though you simply need to push harder, optimize further, strive more perfectly. But what if your paralysis is not evidence of weakness, but a profound refusal to waste another hour pretending you care about things that do not matter? What if this malaise is the final defense of a soul unwilling to trade its essence for the cheap currency of distraction? When the mind loses its relationship with reflection, it forgets how to discern what is real. It begins to confuse urgency with importance, novelty with truth, noise with substance. This confusion breeds an anxious aimlessness, a compulsion to keep moving simply because stillness feels intolerable. But in that movement, nothing essential changes. You remain estranged from yourself, forever orbiting the life you were meant to inhabit, but never entering it. It is a peculiar tragedy that we must relearn what our ancestors understood instinctively, that the moments of quiet, of inactivity, of unstructured time are not dispensable. They are the ground in which purpose takes root. Without them, we are like plants deprived of darkness, forced to grow under an unending glare that bleaches our vitality and leaves us pale and brittle. And so the question becomes unavoidable. What happens when you refuse to pause? When every instant must be filled, every silence must be smothered? The answer is as unsettling as it is simple. You become estranged from your own interior life. You forget how to hear the quiet voice that says, "This is what I love. This is what I fear. This is what I cannot live without." In that forgetting, you forfeit the only compass that can guide you through the labyrinth of existence. Without it, you are condemned to a life of perpetual reaction, a marionette jerked by invisible strings. It does not need to be this way, but reclaiming the capacity for reflection demands a willingness to be uncomfortable. It requires that you cease worshiping at the altar of productivity, that you relinquish the illusion that you can outrun your discontent by moving faster. True motivation is born not in the frenzy of accomplishment, but in the fertile darkness of introspection. It is there, in the unlit corridors of your own psyche, that you will find the slender thread of purpose that can lead you back to yourself. There is no algorithm that can deliver you to this place, no shortcut, no clever hack. You must be willing to turn away from the spectacle, to endure the first wave of unease as the noise recedes. You must consent to be a beginner in the art of listening to your own life. And you must do this without guarantee that what you discover will be pleasing. Because often, the truths waiting in the silence are not tidy. They are not convenient. They may ask you to abandon a path you have invested years in walking. They may ask you to face grief you have buried beneath layers of distraction. But this is the price of freedom. You cannot remain sedated and expect to find purpose. You cannot cling to constant stimulation and hope to hear the whisper of your soul. The one is incompatible with the other. If you are tired of feeling empty, tired of the brittle sweetness of shallow pleasures, tired of the endless performance, you must choose to stop, to listen, to remember. There is no other way. Frankl understood this with a clarity that few ever attain. He knew that in the darkest circumstances imaginable, meaning did not vanish. It simply retreated to a place that could only be reached by those willing to ask the most radical questions. Why am I here? What am I prepared to endure for the sake of what I love? What is the unique responsibility that no one else can fulfill on my behalf? These are questions that terrify us because they admit no easy answers. They strip away every convenient fiction, but they also liberate us from the paralysis of living without conviction. The hunger for meaning is the most human of hungers. It is older than our fear, stronger than our despair, and it waits patiently beneath every layer of numbness, every practiced evasion. It waits for the moment when you are too tired to keep pretending, too weary to keep running. In that moment of collapse, a door opens. You glimpse, if only for an instant, the possibility that your life was never meant to be an endless accumulation of trivial satisfactions. That beneath all your striving, you have always been seeking something simpler and more enduring, a reason to belong to yourself. The voice that speaks in that moment does not shout. It does not command. It simply says, enough. Enough of the noise. Enough of the posturing. Enough of the hollow imitation of a life. And if you are brave enough to heed it, you will find that beneath your exhaustion, there remains an ember of longing that has never been extinguished. An ember that only needed the oxygen of honesty to ignite again. That is why demotivation, far from being a personal defect, is a sacred clue. It is the evidence that some part of you still remembers what it feels like to be whole, to be driven not by compulsion, but by authentic desire, to act not because you are fleeing yourself, but because you are expressing something essential. If you have ever felt this quiet defiance rising inside you, you know it cannot be appeased by another burst of consumption. It will not be lulled back to sleep by the promise of convenience. It wants only one thing: your undivided presence. This is the reckoning that awaits each of us. To stand in the space between stimulus and response and finally choose. Choose to belong to your own life. Choose to reclaim the dignity of acting from purpose rather than habit. Choose to stop moving simply because you are afraid to be still. And in that stillness, you will discover not emptiness, but the profound relief of remembering who you are.